So here we are. The 2024 US election is finally over, and we saw a lot of familiar campaign strategies play out again this year. From TV debates to campaign ads to social media, a lot of it was what we've seen before, but there was one new strategy that was actually pretty unique this year, and that was podcasts. In fact, some experts are actually calling this election the first podcast election with many more to come. However, what I'm really curious about is how did podcasts, just a bunch of people in a room talking for 2 to 3 hours on their mics, turn into this big campaign strategy that was actually used a lot by the winning candidate of this year's US election? Well, let's find out. So first, before we actually dive deep into the strategies used by the candidates, we actually have to consider the overall media landscape that we currently exist in 2024. Now, in 2024, we live in this world where traditional media like traditional radio or cable TV is slowly sliding into the background. Don't trust me? I mean, you have for example, TV shows and movies. If you want to watch that, you're not going to cable TV, you're going to Netflix or another streaming platform. And similarly, with basic entertainment, you're going to YouTube. If you want news, you're probably going to Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. And similar to that, if you want actual true and raw conversations, you're not going to primetime TV and listening to CNN or Fox News. You're probably going to a podcast. Podcasts are where conversations happen, where the audience can actually feel like they're listening to something raw and authentic. Unlike primetime TV, where the audience is more so feeling like they're listening to something super filtered, super tightly controlled, and overall just overly professional. And this has been reflected in traditional media viewership. I mean, just recently, the former CEO of CNN did say that there's been a decline in their viewership due to a loss in trust of traditional media. And I believe this lack of being authentic and raw is a big reason for that. And we've seen trends become normalized over election campaigns. Like for example, in 1960, we saw the first TV debate between Nixon and JFK, and now TV debates are a regular thing in every election campaign. And in the same way, in 2008, President Obama actually used a lot of social media to gain a big audience, especially in young voters. And now every political campaign is using social media to gain a bigger audience. And now in 2024, we're seeing podcasts be used for the same, to gain a bigger audience and attract more voters. And this might just become the next big thing. Who knows? Okay, so now let's actually look at how each campaign used podcasts in this election. Now, quick disclaimer, I'm not here to actually condemn or condone any political strategy or campaign or any policy. Rather, I'm just finding it fascinating how podcasts were used this election, and I find their impact on society and moreover their impact in democratic participation to be pretty fascinating. So in this year's election, we actually saw the candidates take very different approaches to podcasts. On one hand, we saw Donald Trump, who was actually a big proponent of podcasts and he accepted them widely. I mean, if there was any podcast with a decent viewership, Donald Trump was on it. Just to name a few, he was on the Joe Rogan Experience, Flagrant with Andrew Schultz and Akash Singh, Impulsive with Logan Paul, Barstool Sports Bussin' with the Boys, Lex Fridman, Theo Wan, and a lot more other podcasts. And it wasn't even just podcasts, he was doing other long-form content as well. For example, he did this hour-long video of him just on his golf course hanging out with another YouTuber, and they were just playing golf and talking for an hour. There wasn't even anything too crazy political about it. And similarly, he also did a stream with Adin Ross, a pretty famous streamer, and he also did a few Twitter spaces over the campaign as well. So he was embracing a lot of different long-form content. And in this long-form content, he was tapping into spaces where he could just lay back, relax, and chill, and actually be one in the environment. In this environment, Trump came across to audiences as raw and relatable and just overall authentic, without the PR machine actually shaping out every action and answer he gave on stage. Now, this would actually make him come across as relatable to audiences, which was not necessarily the case with the other candidate. Now, Kamala Harris, her strategy was completely different for podcasts. She only did a couple of them, and they weren't even necessarily as laid back or chill as Donald Trump's podcasts. Rather, they were more tightly controlled, managed, and just overly professional. I mean, just to name a couple, she did the Checkup with Dr. Mike and also All the Smoke. These environments, in contrast to Donald Trump, were actually a lot more carefully controlled and just very professional once again. And moreover, when other podcasters like Andrew Schultz or Joe Rogan invited her to their podcast for a similar interview that they did to Trump, She either declined or she set out conditions that would have completely deviated from the actual authenticity of their podcast, which is pretty much what they provide to their audience, authentic conversations. And while I can't definitively say that, well, this is why Kamala Harris lost, this is a move that definitely, well, made her just come across unrelatable and disconnected her from her voter base. So that's just scratching the surface, but let's actually go deeper into why Trump's strategy will really work this election. Well, firstly, you can't fake who you are over hours and hours of conversation. The longer the conversation goes, for 2-3 hours, sometimes even longer than that, the more relaxed you become and the more the inner you actually starts coming out. Podcasts let people become comfortable, and that's where actual voter trust between the candidate and the voter starts to get built. This isn't the same type of stuff that you see on traditional TV where there's a lack of raw and authentic moments. Rather, there's actually a distrust, just like the CNN CEO was recently saying. And this wasn't really just limited to podcasts. I mean, some of Trump's most famous moments this campaign cycle were him just, well, you know, being his more instinctive self and connecting to the average person, whether it be, well, working at a McDonald's drive-thru or being in the garbage truck's driver's seat, or even, you know, just like his instinctive response when he was getting shot at. These are all just human moments, and this was what actually connected him to his voter base. Okay, so just as I finished shooting this video, I came across this video on my Twitter feed of Trump playing tennis with Serena Williams. Also very authentic, not gonna lie. But yeah, back to the video. Moreover, on that note, it wasn't just like the way he was saying stuff and the stuff he was saying, but also it was the environment that he was in. Once again, he was in a laid back and more chill environment where he could just be his true self. He was joking around with comedians, just chilling with streamers, and also just hanging out on his golf course. But at the same time, he doesn't shy away from like talking about his political policy. That's what he was doing on the Flagrant podcast, which is literally hosted by comedians. So him talking about his policy in these super chill environments is what actually made him seem like somebody that you could just like sit down at a restaurant and have a super chill and normal conversation with. But even more than that, he was actually showing up everywhere, whether it be Theo One or even the Joe Rogan Experience or Impulsive. He was on a variety of shows and he was on a lot of them too. Now he could have just stuck to the big ones like Joe Rogan, but why was he going on all these smaller ones too? Well, he was building a library of content, and this content could actually be clipped and reused many times over different social media, whether it be Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and you just see this guy's face everywhere because a lot of what he was saying in these raw and authentic moments was just stuff that could be instantly viral and catches a lot of attention. With this move, Donald Trump was actually building a whole library of content that could just repeatedly be rewatched, repurposed, reshared, and all of that stuff. Unlike Kamala Harris, who's like doing more single take moments on more traditional means like just traditional media like CNN, or even more traditional means like just rallies, which wasn't exactly getting a lot of attention because this isn't where she was being her authentic and true raw self. So on that note, let's actually move on to why Kamala's strategy didn't stick. Now, Kamala's strategy was actually still going to other podcasts as well, but she was being a lot more safe about it, if that makes sense. Kamala's interviews were more tightly controlled and overly professional. Now, being overly professional isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, after all, she was running for the president of the most powerful country in the world. However, to connect with the viewer in this day and age, you have to be a little less professional and more relatable. While the polished and scripted version did keep her on brand and on track, she did come across as overly controlled, and unfortunately for her, that isn't what the audiences want in 2024. They once again want the true version of yourself, the one that they can relate to, the one that they feel like they could just have an average dinner conversation with. But let's be real too. There is a valid reason for Kamala to not go on these podcasts. I mean, after all, a lot of these podcasts have made more controversial decisions or controversial statements, or even had some controversial guests on the past. Or even just putting that aside, I mean, maybe Kamala just feared going on a podcast with views that might align more right-wing, might actually not be a good look for her. However, I did think about that, but then you also do realize Kamala Harris was on Fox News giving interviews, and that was probably her best moment of the campaign. And honestly, I would have actually loved to see more of her going on these types of podcasts where she could actually challenge the narrative and actually seem to be a more true and authentic person that relates to the average American. Moreover, I think these podcasts would have done a fine job. I mean, recently Flagrant also did an interview with Mark Cuban, and Mark Cuban is a pretty vocal critic of people like Donald Trump, especially during this election cycle. However, that podcast was actually pretty great, and they overall just did a great job at interviewing Mark Cuban, and I would have loved to see something similar for Kamala Harris, who was, well, Donald Trump's main opponent. So honestly, I actually think Kamala Harris could have actually nailed it if she went on these podcasts. However, for some reason, she and her team decided not to, which definitely did once again disconnect her from a potential voter base. So what's the bigger picture here? Well, I believe in 2024, we're in this day and age where podcasts have actually changed our expectations for political candidates. We're in this era where we actually want podcasts to host more politicians and more candidates, so we can actually see them on a mic for 2 to 3 hours, where they can't actually be behind the same sound bites and political slogans and scripted answers for that long of a time, but rather at some point they actually have to be their true, raw and authentic self. And honestly, even for the politicians, when you're there on a mic for 2 to 3 hours being unscripted and your real self, that's when you start to gain trust from voters. And I think politicians are starting to get that. I mean, recently just AOC, this like Democratic candidate, she was on her Instagram story asking for what podcasts are Republicans using to attract a lot of voters, probably because her as a big Democrat candidate does probably want to use the same mean. So at the end of the day, while this election was still pretty big on policies, there was a certain extent where it was about the relationship that candidates built with voters, and that relationship was about trust, familiarity, and overall just authenticity. And voters in 2024 are smart. They know when they're getting the polished and scripted version, and they know when they're getting the raw and authentic version, and they saw that this election. And I truly think that Donald Trump and his team truly got that, and Kamala Harris, well, she did not get that. And that's why Trump took the advantage and was on every corner of the internet being a relatable human being, while Kamala Harris was on traditional TV, which doesn't even have that much viewership anymore, and being this more polished person, which once again, not necessarily a bad thing for a future president, but at the same time, it's not what voters want in 2024. So what does this mean for future campaigns? Well, for one, podcasts, YouTube content, Twitch streams, Twitter spaces, all this long form content isn't going anywhere for a long time, and it's here to stay. But also, I truly believe that candidates are going to realize that voters want the truly unfiltered, unscripted, and authentic version of them. Not the TV polished one, but the one that you can actually have a seat with at dinner and have a genuine conversation with. And I truly believe that this is the new standard in this digital era. That being said, if you truly like this video, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have anything to share, I'd love to read it down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.